welcome to the Life of Learning podcast. I'm Justus Frank, and today I want to talk about the Feynman technique, as well as a few other things that I find were kind of related to that. I tend to listen to a lot of audiobooks. I like to listen to audiobooks while I'm driving, and those sorts of... I listen to a lot of audiobooks, particularly while I'm driving, and the book I'm listening to currently is called Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I think I've said that more or less correct. And in it, he makes an interesting point regarding free time or leisure time, and the fact that within our society we tend to have this view of a very distinct free time, a very distinct leisure time, and a very distinct work time. Through research that I've done in the past, I found that this has come about partially also through some of the Protestant work ethic, and that's a whole sort of another topic, and I have talked about this before, but basically we had this growth in this idea of splitting leisure time and work time. We're taught this from a very young age. So if you look at schools, we have class time and we've got free time, so lunch time. And this way of thinking is in all parts of our life, really. It used to be that in the past we would have, yes, we might have some work that would really go out and do. For instance, if you were a farmer, you'd go and work out on the farm. But even when you came back home, you would still be doing some sort of creative activity. So while you're having a conversation, you might be knitting wool, and then other entertainment as well. Because back in the day they didn't have a lot of passive entertainment, people actually had to create their own entertainment. So a lot of people were able to play instruments, for instance, and make their own music, which is less so today. In terms of today, we have more passive forms of entertainment, where we are simply sitting and listening or watching. And Csikszentmihalyi makes the point that because we have more passive forms of leisure time, that we can actually, in the long term, those states, just being in these passive states, can actually be quite depressing. And you know, we all feel these sort of things as well, where we've spent too much time on Facebook or whatever it might be, and we feel, oh, well, that was actually a waste of time. I could have actually been doing something. Why wasn't I doing something? And that we actually feel good when we've got goals and when we're striving to achieve something, and when we feel that we're growing, that we're developing. When we're growing and developing, we actually have to be doing something of some sort, and not just simply passively taking things in. This got me thinking about what I'm doing here in this podcast, and what other podcasters are doing, and people who write articles, and people who create things. That maybe it isn't the best thing to completely cut off and separate work and leisure time, and that in fact creating, making things, exploring things in a useful way that builds us up is actually a very powerful thing, and an enjoyable thing, something that in a sense is leisure, and instead of work being tedious, that it is in fact fun, and it is adventurous, and we can feel ourselves growing. And that, as Csikszentmihalyi puts it in, I mean, that's what the whole book is basically about, is achieving these states of flow, basically these moments where we are so focused and so absorbed by what we're doing that, well, time ceases to be relevant, and we are so within the moment and we're enjoying the moment. In order to get into these states of flow, we can't just be passive. We need to be doing something. And as this was in my mind, I happened to come across an article, which then led me on to another article, which then led me on to another article. And there were some interesting things within these articles. And one of the first articles that I came to was all about the Feynman technique. And so the article was basically titled "The Feynman Technique: The Best Way to Learn Anything." And this article was about taking the technique that was basically developed or labeled by Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel-winning physicist. So what is the Feynman technique? It's basically saying that in order to learn something, the best way of doing that is to actually explain it. And the best way to explain something is to explain it in simple language. One of the ways that we tend to trick ourselves is that we often use very complicated vocabulary and jargon, and it can actually mask our understanding. We add all these fancy words in, and it makes it all sound better, but do we really understand it? And that's why the Feynman technique basically says, pretend, or actually go do, teach this to a child. So speak in a way that a child will be able to understand. And in a sense, I guess this is what I am currently doing and what I'm doing here. I'm not necessarily speaking to children, but in doing these videos, I try to avoid using too much jargon, too much extra vocabulary. I try to make it really understandable. Every now and then I will use a more complicated word, but I want to try and make this as easy to understand as possible, because in doing so I actually begin to realize whether or not I've actually understood it or not. If I find myself using too much jargon, too much complicated language, then it feels like, well, do I actually understand all that jargon? And so it's a really good skill to think about explaining what you know to someone who has less knowledge of the subject than you, a lot less knowledge of the subject than you. And then of course there's time to go back and review, think about, did this explanation actually work? Are there words which I feel I need to use jargon, but if I am going to use the jargon, can I still explain those words? So for example, a few days ago I made a video and I talked about epistemology. Now that's a very jargon type word, but can I actually explain in simple language what that means? And that's a really key part. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we get to know things, how we go about knowing things, how we go about gaining knowledge. So that's a more simplified version of the word, and we should be able, if we are going to use jargon words, we should be able to at least explain what they mean in very simple language. You do actually want to try and test yourself by actually having conversations, and that's the thing that I've found was one of the most powerful things in my life. When I realized that I had all these ideas in my head and I wanted to explain them to others, and trying to find a way in terms of making them simple to understand and straightforward to understand. And so hopefully that is what I'm doing here. I'm trying not to make things too complicated. And there's a really fantastic quote within this article that I think is really awesome. And it says, it's by Mortimer Adler, and he says this: "The person who says he knows what he thinks but cannot express it usually does not know what he thinks." And I've talked about this before. You know, people like to say when they try to explain a concept to you, and then they get really frustrated, and they go, "Well, I read it in some book," and you know, you just go read the book, and it will make sense. But the thing is that it actually needs to make sense to you, and possibly if you're not able to explain it, then that's okay. It's actually okay. It's just that maybe you need to go back to the book, reread it, think about it, and see if you can really condense it down, break it down into something that's really understandable and manageable. And so I came across another article that hopefully puts all of this together. As I stated before, I like to read or listen to books when I drive, and I want to make sure that the things that I'm listening to and the things that I really find good in the moment, that I actually don't just leave it there. I don't just forget it. I don't just leave it, but that I actually make use of that I continue to learn these concepts and make use of them. And that's why I make these podcasts. And this is kind of combining these two ideas that I had before, in terms of that we work better when we are creative rather than passive, and that we learn better when we are creative rather than passive, and we get into better states of flow when we are creative rather than passive. And also the fact that explaining things is a great way to learn things. So in combining these two things, I think that's why things like podcasts, why writing, even if you keep a journal or something like that, is really fantastic. Because what you are basically doing is you are spending time reflecting on the things that you have learnt, but you're doing that reflection in a very creative sort of way. You're actually producing something, you're making something. And this goes on to some other research that I also saw, and this bit of research demonstrated that employees who spent 15 minutes at the end of the day reflecting about lessons learned performed 23% better after 10 days than those who did not reflect. And there's another study with UK commuters that also found a similar result, when those who were prompted to use their commute to think about and plan for their day, they were happier and more productive and less burned out than people who didn't. And so it's this concept that reflection is really a really good and important part of what we need to be doing as human beings. We can't just always be doing. That we need to take the time to reflect, and actually that time is, while it doesn't seem like we're doing much, it's actually really important and actually makes us more productive in the long term. And in a sense, that's again why I do these podcasts, why I write articles, is so I can reflect on all these things that I'm learning and trying to understand. But I'm doing that reflection in a very creative way, where I'm actually producing something. And so if you're thinking about this for your own life, again, I don't think there's necessarily a right way of doing this, but basically I guess I would encourage people to, whatever their passion is, wherever they're going, that they take that time to reflect, and they reflect in a creative way, in a way that is useful and beneficial. And if you can, obviously have conversations with people, write journals, have conversations, and even have conversations with children, again, and try and explain some of the things that you're puzzling out through your work or whatever. Try to explain those concepts to people, and so in doing that, you will actually understand your work in a far deeper and more meaningful way, and you will learn and grow far better. So those are some of my thoughts around that. Hopefully that was helpful. I know, again, it was helpful for me to get this all out here. That's kind of the very point of what I'm saying. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Alright, thanks. Bye.